can figure out to show you that energy and mass are interchangeable through E equals mc squared. But I can't figure out for the life of me the WAR formula.
Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole for Park Ridge Sports History. I'd like to welcome you to another edition, and once again thank Howard Fredericks and you, the Park Ridge townspeople, for allowing me to come into your homes each week, it seems now, and talk nothing but sports history. As you can see, the theme this week would be about baseball's new metric/statistic, and that is WAR, which stands for wins above replacement. And of course, this is the evolution of the game, which has been basically started back in the late 70s with the authorship of Baseball Analytics by Bill James, and of course, a plethora of new metrics and analysis of statistics and players' abilities and talents, both on the offense and the defense side of the field, has just exploded on the game. And why it's important is that baseball more and more is understanding basically the nuances of the game, something that many baseball fans have realized, but it seems like the game itself has just started to understand in the last 30, 40 years. And I'll just give you a perfect case. Many times walks back in, let's say, the early 70s and late 60s were not seen as such a important offensive statistic. In fact, they were kind of looked down upon by maybe managers and general managers of the game. They were looking for, obviously, guys who could get hits and all the rest of it. Obviously, that's important. But what we are seeing now is, and of course, this was popularized by the book and then the movie Moneyball, is that whatever you can do to get on base via a hit by pitch, or a base on balls, or even catcher interference is important in the ultimate goal of scoring runs. And in fact, there's many cases where I think general managers really rely on the walks because it wears down the pitcher and, of course, his pitch count. And you are seeing many of the hitters going deeper into the count on every at-bat. And anecdotally, you can see this if you watch the old, some of the old YouTube games. You'll see games in which players come up, maybe they take a few pitches the first couple of times, but then when they get it, and when they feel like they really get to know the pitcher, they lash out the first time a pitch that they like comes to their to the plate. So the game has changed that way in terms of strategy, and it is a better game strategically. It's more of a chess game today than it was 10, 15, 50, even 60 years ago. But it's really a discovery of something that old-time fans and maybe the inside players, or players that really understood the game and the science of the game already understood and knew. I'd like to focus on the WAR because this is a problem. First of all, if you are unaware of what WAR is, it's basically taking all of an offensive player's statistics. Actually, it's all of their runs that they have accumulated and coming up with a formula. Do I understand it perfectly like I do ERA or batting average or slugging percentage? No, I don't, because I know that it's been nuanced and things change. But I figured this today. And this is the problem with the WAR, is that one, I think, and I don't mean this to sound, I don't mean this to sound like I'm belittling the baseball fan and obviously promoting, let's say, the metrics guy. But WAR is understood because it's kind of complicated. It doesn't roll off the tip of your tongue. like ERA, which is earned runs times 9 divided by innings pitched, or batting average, which is hits divided by at bats equals your batting average. This is kind of an semblance of taking things in all facets of the games to come up with the formula. And this formula, though, like anything else, when you're dealing with the human condition, it's filled with, it's not a perfect science, obviously, because you're dealing with the human condition. And there are some things where you say, wait a minute, I can't believe that this guy's WAR is higher than this guy's, and yet this guy is a Hall of Famer, and this particular player isn't. So I thought maybe today what we could do is investigate the players with controversial WARs, or players that you say, you know what, maybe if you take a look at the WAR and almost give it back to the writers and the metrics guys, you start to say, hey, how come this guy isn't in the Hall of Fame if his WAR, and you are taking in also not just his offensive stats, but his positional in terms of context where he plays in position, and also what they call the fielding runs. Something that I have to be honest with you is kind of new to me. I know that we can figure out errors and a fielding percentage. The big thing now with the baseball metrics is FRAA, which is fielding range above average, kind of like the WAR. These are all formulas that constantly or are in the process of constantly being tweaked because they want to get as close to perfect as they can. But many times it leaves fans, just like me, in doubt of where this formula is going. And sometimes it doesn't really meet the eye test. And I think without further ado, we'll just get right into it, and I'll show you some of the famous guys. Actually, I have from Baseball Reference, and I'm also using some statistics from Baseball Almanac. I'm going to go to the all-time career leaders. Strangely enough, Bobby Bonds, I don't have his baseball card, nor do I have Babe Ruth's baseball card with me, but Bonds is the all-time WAR leader at 162.8. He nudges out Babe Ruth by 162.1. Now, the interesting thing, though, is this. There is a WAR that is separate and unique for pitchers as opposed to hitters. And I am sure that probably the people who assembled the WAR have probably combined the two, pitching and hitting, for Babe Ruth, because before Babe Ruth became a full-time hitter, he was a heck of a pitcher. In fact, I did a statistical breakdown. I think he met the great Walter Johnson, who won over 400 games. And yes, he was mired with the Washington Senators for his whole career. But I believe when I did the analysis, they met 8 times, and Ruth basically dominated him. And of course, this is going with Ruth with the Red Sox and a couple of seasons where he did pitch for the Yankees in spots. There was one particular game that was just unbelievable, and I think it really encapsulates their kind of pitching rivalry. They went to extra innings, and Ruth bested Walter Johnson in extra innings. I think they went to the 13th inning. They amassed 28 strikeouts between them. Ruth, I think, had 15 and Johnson had 13, and Ruth beat him 2-1. And both pitchers went 13 innings. I believe between them, they allowed 10 hits in the game. Now, strikeouts, of course, we used to as kids, and I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s, when a pitcher had 10 strikeouts in a game, it was a cause to celebrate in many respects. Today, if they don't have 10 strikeouts by the end of the 4th inning, you're wondering, oh, wow, is their arm sore? Are they tired? Are the hitters on to their pitchers? Because as I've said, and I do sound critical of the game, it has been reduced to a wiffle ball outing in your backyard. Home runs, walks, strikeouts. Home runs, walks, strikeouts. And I know I've simplified it, but obviously, baseball's got to do something about that. I've harped on that. But I just wanted to show you this one. I was going to get a picture of Willie Mays from the late 60s, about 65, 66. And I was going to get a picture of Hank Aaron because they are number 3 and 5 all time. Space between them is Ty Cobb, ironically, at 151. However, statistically, this is what's amazing to me. Here is Mays and Hank Aaron, tops in the National League. Now, according to the W.A.R, the formula is amassing all their runs, both offensively and potentially defensively. I don't think it is out of the realm to say that the argument is that you could make a great case and probably have probably quite it would be easy to defend because you have so much of an arsenal behind it. You'd have to say that Mays is the greatest defensive player of all time. Here's where I use that little nugget. Aaron out-homered Mays by almost 100. He's the all-time leader in runs scored. Mays has him in batting average. Now, I'm just giving you the top 3. But this formula really brings in the W.A.R itself, the wins above replacement, is so, I would say, intricate, so detailed. And yet Mays bests Aaron by 13 points, leading really for when you come away from the analysis, that implies and you can infer that without a doubt, Mays was by far the better defensive fielder. And maybe he's saving quite a few runs each year with his glove. And I know that one thing about fielding, it's a very difficult, that is really, they've done so much work into determining what really constitutes a good fielder and you know, who is better than others, who stands out above the others. Mays, by every metrics, is probably the greatest fielder of all time. Now, obviously, he didn't catch. He didn't play third base. He wasn't shortstop. Yes, you could argue that shortstop, probably in our lifetime, and probably if you did the metrics on it defensively, Ozzie Smith might be the greatest shortstop defensively of all time. And maybe Brooks Robinson. Notice what I said. Maybe Brooks Robinson might be the greatest defensive third baseman of all time. Although I've seen just this year alone some of the highlights, and they look very Brooks Robinson-like with some of these third bases, among them Nolan Arenado from Colorado. It's amazing. Me, you'd have to have a strong argument against this guy, but that would be Johnny Bench, the greatest defensive catcher of all time. I know that Tom Seaver had said that he felt Grote was the better defensive catcher, but we're talking about a Hall of Famer in Johnny Bench. And maybe there are better catchers today defensively, guys who can frame, which is also part of their fielding range, how they frame a pitch and all the rest of it. But I'm going to be prejudiced when I say this. I think Bench is the greatest catcher of all time defensively. I think that he changed the way that a catcher went about his position. Outside of maybe Yogi Berra, I think there's no other player that really glamorized the position of catcher than Johnny Bench. And he came along at a perfect time, being part of the Big Red Machine, television, of course, that 75 series. And he, without a doubt, had a charisma and an athleticism that really made him a hero to a lot of kids as a baseball player, including me. So Aaron kind of best Mays in home runs, RBIs, runs scored, and yet Willie Mays wins above replacement is by far 156.2. He's 13 points better than Hank Aaron. And yet Bonds beats Mays by 6 points. And yes, Bonds had incredible seasons with the Giants, ironically enough. Bonds drew tons of walks. But here's my problem. Bonds played left, didn't have as good as an arm. If we're talking, we're not talking just offensively here. And yes, maybe the guys who are very expert with the wins above replacement formula will obviously could prove it to me, but this is where the just looking at a player and knowing the player from just watching him every day. Are you telling me that Bonds' offense was better than Mays' offense and defense? Because if it was, I mean, if Bonds was that good, I think it would come out more with the defense. And here's the thing. Bonds never played, well, I shouldn't say he never played center field, but he was primarily a left fielder. And of course, left field, you have to be strong up the middle. You usually have your best defensive player in center. Maybe not the guy with the best arm necessarily. Usually that's in right. And obviously, if you have those two of the three elements, usually the left fielder is probably your weakest of all the defensive outfielders. That's not a knock against Bonds as much as Mays patrolled the outfield. He was basically, you could probably argue that Mays, putting him out in center field, you're talking about not putting one player out there, but he's a player and a half in terms of the outfield. And he patrolled the Polo Grounds, and he patrolled Candlestick Park, which was a very difficult park to play in because of the wind being so tough and it being always, it seemed, to be so cold. Interesting that Mays is number 3 and Bonds is number 1. And of course, Aaron being number 5. Here's the drama of all this. And I'd really like to put up, I could be talking all day about the high guys in wins above replacement all the time. Mickey Mantle's at number 16. The last guy to be at 100 is Joe Morgan. Albert Pujols is probably going to move up over his career. Well, I shouldn't say that because last year he was seen as having a negative WAR, or actually a negative WAR the last 2 years. So he may drop from his present 101 and actually dip below and maybe fall behind a Carl Yastrzemski, who is 96.4. Now, why I'm also including this, Eddie Matthews, who is a very good third baseman, 512 home runs lifetime. Actually, and this is where the WAR surprises you. And of course, I didn't see Matthews play, just from what I know. I did see Clemente play, I saw Yastrzemski play, and I saw Joe Morgan play. Now, Morgan's at 100. I think the WAR is a perfect formula for a guy like Morgan. Why? Well, he wasn't a big home run hitter, but he was a very good home run hitter for his position, second base. His life or his career might have been different if he was a center fielder averaging 15 home runs a year as opposed to playing second base, hitting 15 or 16. Plus, Morgan does two things. He draws a ton of walks, and he steals a lot of bases. Now, the stealing of the bases, it's kind of been put down a couple of pegs here in the wiffle ball era of baseball. The home runs, and of course the walks. If Morgan's 100 plus, well, he didn't average 100 plus walks, but very close, 90 for his career. If his walks or the understanding of walks back in the 60s and 70s was more important, Morgan would have been seen as probably the best all-around player, not just for 2 years, but for about 4 or 5. All right. So you have Morgan. He's basically the last guy standing with 100 points or above on the WAR. And then it gets into the 90s. And just take a look at the 90s. You have guys in the 90s include Yastrzemski, Matthews, Ripken, Clemente, Cap Anson, Adrian Beltre, Jimmy Fox, Al Kaline. That was a huge surprise for me. Because when I was a kid, even though you realize the brilliance of Kaline, the WAR, another guy who really benefits from the WAR because he was a very good defensive right fielder, but he benefits from the WAR because now you really start to appreciate Al Kaline. He didn't finish with 300 batting average. He didn't finish with 400 home runs. He was shy 399. And he had 297 lifetime. But he does have 3,700 hits lifetime. And in fact, when he was asked that question, that he was 1 home run short, he actually did pretty much say, if I had known I was only 1 home run short, I probably would have stuck around to try to get that 400. Probably would have hurt his batting average. Actually, being at 399, we're able to talk and bring him up though, because at 400, he would have reached that level. But just remember this: doesn't seem like a lot, but he retires with, let's just say 400. Well, 399. All my nickel dime fans out there, 399 home runs in 1974. At the time, Aaron was still playing, hadn't broken the record. Frank Robinson was still playing. Killebrew was still playing. So that 400 or 399 really puts Al Kaline. Oh, Billy Williams was still playing. He finished with 426. So you see that when he retired, his home run output was kind of high in terms of all-time best. So Al Kaline really, really has an incredible WAR when you think about it. The guy right behind him, and if you take a look at his stats, it's Wade Boggs. Now, Wade Boggs had incredible numbers for batting average, and he is actually higher than George Brett, and actually higher than Chipper Jones and Charlie Gehringer. I don't know who I would take, Boggs or Brett, to start my team, but I think I would be going towards more of Brett. And I've mentioned on the program prior that Boggs was always marked as a mediocre third baseman, but he did improve and make sure that he did improve. And he does win a Gold Glove, I do believe. In fact, Boggs wins Gold Glove, I think, in his last year. He won actually 2 Gold Gloves with the Yankees, interestingly enough. Like I said, George Brett at 88.6, so Boggs really ends the 90s. The interesting thing, among the guys who are in the 80s, and this is what I'm coming to, it's Carew, Bagwell, Pete Rose, he's not in the Hall of Fame, obviously, Joe DiMaggio at 79.1. Now you say to yourself, many Yankee fans consider him on the Mount Rushmore, all-time Yankees, along with Gehrig and Ruth and Mantle. All right, can be made arguments for or against. We've talked about that before, and you start to say, well, why is DiMaggio kind of so low, only at 79? And you see that Yaz is higher or Clemente's higher. And what probably hurts DiMaggio the most is the fact that he only played 13 years. So he wasn't able to accrue a number of it wasn't able to accrue numbers in different statistics like home runs and batting average or all-time hits, etc. So he's probably hurt that way. Oh, by the way, probably his chief rival, interestingly enough, a guy who missed pretty much 5 years to military service. Ted Williams is number 11 all time. Number 11. And of course, Williams is also has the distinction of being a 4-decade man, going from 1939 to 1960, and also hitting a home run in his last at bat. In many respects, Williams, I've often said this, he's kind of like the John Wayne of baseball. Big, rugged, kind of outspoken, always associated with the military, although Wayne never served. I know that, but just seems to be that big, rugged kind of guy. And Williams had an incredible career. 2 Triple Crowns, neither of which led, interestingly enough, to MVPs. But his contemporary, but he has almost 50, he's 50 points higher than DiMaggio. Here's the thing. Suppose he had those extra 5 years in military, or even slice that. Maybe he doesn't have to go back during the Korea War and serve for the United States. What would he have done with, let's say, those 2 extra years? How high would he have been in terms of war? Even if you took maybe the barest of numbers and said 25, 90, and maybe 310 those 2 years. And of course, I'm deflating his numbers dramatically. Mind you, he might be the greatest war player of all time. No pun intended. Probably even higher than Barry Bonds. And that's just me knocking his stats down to almost not superhuman, but elite level of athlete. Now, Johnny Bench, 75.2. And this brings me up to this. So from Johnny Bench is actually number 50 all time. He is a Hall of Famer. His numbers, quote unquote, are lower than, let's say, a Rod Carew or a Ken Griffey Jr. or a Chipper Jones, George Brett, Wade Boggs, and Al Kaline. This is where everything is in context. And this is what I was saying about Joe Morgan, why it applies to him, is that there are certain positions that almost require that you give a little bit leeway in terms of offense and offensive production. One of those being catcher. And the other probably, well, shortstop and second. So much because of the defense required. And especially with a catcher who has to not just babysit his own batting and take care of that, but he's got to babysit about 11 starting pitchers and relief pitchers on his staff on a daily basis. So he's got to be a coach on the field, which is why many of them do go into managing. Many of them become very good managers. Not all, but many. They are very aware of the game within the game, and they have to manage so much. And that's one thing that Bench was able to do. And really, when you think about it, Johnny Bench had some good pitchers that he did call games for. He basically only had, though, of a pitcher who was elite, he had Tom Seaver later in Seaver's career. It would have been interesting, though, had Bench had, let's say, a Hall of Fame pitcher with the Reds, and to see what maybe those two could have accomplished as a battery mate. As it was, Seaver won 20 games for the Cincinnati Reds and throws a no-hitter. So, and when I say he won 20 games, when he came over from the Mets, yes, he does win 21 games in 77, but some of those were with the Mets. So technically, again, the nickel dime. I just want to get that out there. But Bench is at 75. I don't think there's any question that he should be in the Hall of Fame. Statistically, okay, compared to today's catchers, his 267 batting average, his 387 home runs lifetime might pale or might go down to a certain extent against today's catchers, but you have to take it in context. And here's the other thing. I actually believe this. This is where I argue against the WAR, and that is that you cannot kill bench with his 75.2. I think the WAR really hurts him in terms of how many runs he was responsible for saving on the defensive side. So I think actually maybe they could come up with maybe a different statistic or a different element that you add to the catching position, because over the over the time of a catcher during the season, he's beat up constantly. He has many injuries, soreness, just completely being beaten up all the time. And then, of course, mentally, he has to split his game between. Actually, he doesn't really split his game. If he did that, he's not going to be a successful catcher. He mentally has to be focused on the pitcher of the game and worry about his performance rather than his batting and other things. Why I bring up bench? Because number 51 presently. Well, actually, I'll tell you this. Number 52 is Mike Trout, and he is moving up each and every day. He's at 74.1. So I would say by the end of the year, if he hasn't, although this is kind of updated, I am sure he is going to probably finish. He's probably going to be where Ozzie Smith at 76.9 is. See, here's the other thing too. Bench is at 50. And I think Ozzie, for whatever reason, really benefits defensively at number 46, being, 1.3, 1.7 higher than bench. Somehow the WAR really helped him defensively, where I think we have to do something different for the catchers for the reasons I just stated. But in between Mike Trout and Johnny Bench is a guy who I'm really disappointed is not in the Hall of Fame. And that is a guy by the name of Lou Whitaker. But Lou Whitaker, I was always surprised that he hasn't gotten more of a push for the Hall of Fame. His partner, Alan Trammell, is in, but this kind of proves it because Trammell is lower on the WAR than Whitaker was. And Whitaker spent, I just want to give you, Whitaker spent, I think, 19 years. And he spent 19 years all with the Tigers. And I always feel like that should be a pretty good component in telling you the worth of a player, that the team keeps them for 19 years, especially a guy like Whitaker, who I think, he was on the cusp of Morgan's career. Probably didn't have the same charisma as Morgan. They do have a couple of good seasons in Detroit where they win the whole thing in '84. He's there for '87. The Tigers make the American League. They win the division and lose, of course, to the Twins in the divisional championship. But Whitaker, I think, was always hurt by this. One, doesn't lead the league in anything, doesn't drive in 100 runs, has a 276 batting average. I get all that. But you are dealing with a guy, 2,300 hits, 143 stolen bases, 244 runs. So he had some speed, had some pop, right? According to Baseball Reference, his 162 game average would be 17 homers, 81 walks, 73 RBIs, and a solid 276 average. Now, the reason why he's hurt is probably because he is kind of a contemporary of Morgan. And even though Morgan doesn't hit 300, he hits almost 250 home runs, or he hits over 250 home runs. And of course, he wins 2 MVPs, he hits over 300 quite a few times. Whitaker does hit 300. He has an unbelievable season. He goes 1272 and hits 320 in 83. And then in their World Series run, he goes 1356 and 289. Now, maybe you can say, they're average stats. But remember, he's playing second base. He is teamed with Alan Trammell. who is also very similar in stats. I know that Trammell probably has him over home runs a little bit, and probably has a few more all-star appearances. But they were a very good double play combination. And I wish and how do I here's the thing. If he was a far inferior player or is being overlooked by the writers on all this, his WAR is higher than a number of Hall of Famers, including his contemporary Alan Trammell. So I wish baseball would look at him, because do I think he's an all-time great player on the level of Morgan? No, but you know what? He's a very good player. And of course, as I stated to you, we know who the great Hall of Famers are. We know that it's Mays and Ruth, and we know it's Aaron. And then there's another level. And then there's probably another level. All right. His stats, playing second base, which I said to you earlier, very important spot in terms of defense. They're higher than Billy Williams, who played the outfield for the Cubs, and they never won a championship. They never even got close. Williams does play on the 75As, and he does get a taste of postseason. And he does hit 426 home runs, finishes second. Here's the interesting thing with Billy Williams, who is lower on the grid, but he actually finished second in the MVP, and both times he lost to Johnny Bench, 1970 and 72. All right? So he's higher. This Lou Whitaker, he's higher than Frank Thomas, known for his offense. So he's higher than Derek Jeter. And we know that Jeter, you can always almost bet that he is going into the Hall of Fame on the first ballot. And probably with Jeter, it's going to be the same thing. What percentage of first place, how high is it going to be? It's not going to be 100. It may be 89%. It will probably be in the 90s. I know that there's a lot of naysayers who say he was just a regular player. Actually, this kind of points to that. I mean, Whitaker's in, and he played a good second base, won Gold Gloves, and did partake in 2 division teams, 1 pennant, and 1 World Series winner. He is higher, Whitaker, than Johnny Mize. And of course, 2 different players. I get it. I'm just giving you the WAR on all this. He's higher than Jim Thome. I was really surprised at that. He's higher than Larry Walker, who was just the latest entrant into the Hall of Fame. And he is, like I said, higher than Trammell. And he's higher than Barry Larkin, who was seen as the quintessential shortstop in the National League. Everything that you wanted your shortstop in the 90s to embody. Good power, good leadership, great defense. And even though I rooted for Larkin, I'm one of those guys who said, wow, was he really a Hall of Famer? Does win the MVP, something that Whitaker doesn't. But, that can also be the ignorance of the writers as well. And I'm not disparaging the writers. They're saying sometimes these quiet players playing in these cities are overlooked. All right. He's higher than Ron Santo. And of course, they had basically almost a writing campaign to get Santo in there. I'm not saying he doesn't belong. I'm just saying that Whitaker's higher. Carter, I'm throwing out Carter because it's my catcher type of thing. Carter was a catcher. We have to treat them differently in terms of WAR. But he's also higher than Tony Gwynn and Tim Raines, who I told you might be arguably, along with Rickey Henderson, probably the 2 greatest leadoff hitters of the last 50 years, better than Pete Rose. He's higher than, I'm going to throw Fisk out of here. He's higher than Eddie Murray. All right. And he's higher than Ryne Sandberg. Now, and he's higher than Ernie Banks, who also played shortstop for the Cubs. So I guess this show has turned into a campaign for Whitaker and getting him into the Hall of Fame some way, somehow. Either be either vote or actually really the Veterans Committee. I hope they really do take a look at him because he so defines those Tigers of the 80s. You can't say Trammell without saying Whitaker. Okay? Another player, here's two guys that are in the Hall of Fame. I wanted to show both pictures. And I would say that Nellie Fox is in for a number of reasons. And Harmon Killebrew, both class guys. I'm showing this one picture as I move it up. I think Nellie Fox is not just in because of his defensive play with the White Sox, but also with that chaw. I think he is one of the MVPs when it comes to having a chaw of tobacco in your cheek. He embodied the players of those 40s and 50s. That big chaw coming out. Looks like they always had a permanent toothache. And, of course, here's Harmon Killebrew and Nellie Fox. And I think I mentioned this. Killebrew at one time was one of the leading home run hitters of all time. Finished with 573. Finished his last years with the Royals. MVP. But surprisingly, his stats or his WAR is lower than I thought. Okay? In fact, Killebrew, just for time constraints, I'm not going to look. I know that it was lower than a number of players, including the guy who I'm about to announce. Another guy that may be 70, Bobby Grich is player with the Angels, player with the Orioles for the most part. Never got to the World Series, obviously. I think he would have been a guy that, had he gotten to the series, it would have been interesting as to what he did. Grich finished with a 71.1 WAR, just like Whitaker. Never led the league except for, 1981, he actually led the league in home runs. I apologize. I did know that and just forgot that. That was the strike shortened season. They only played 100 and some odd games, 108, I think. Grich had 22 home runs and led the league in slugging with 543. He also led the league in games played, 162. His output, basically as a second baseman, 18 and 70, 266 batting average. Does win the Gold Gloves 4 times, in fact. Finished in the MVP race, top 15 3 times. And yet he's not in the Hall of Fame. Classy guy here. And that's the WAR. And there are some problems with the WAR, but there's some gold nuggets. There's some interesting things with it too. I'd like to thank you again for allowing me to come into your homes, and I'll see you with an episode next week. Bye now.